Our breakfast speaker is an incredibly successful businessman who recognizes the critical importance of a quality education and the power technology has to completely transform education. I don't know if you saw the speech that Rupert Murdoch gave to the EG8 summit, but he challenged the world leaders to embrace innovation in education, unleash the power of technology to customize education for every student, and empower today's students with knowledge, skills, ability to think critically, which are the essential ingredients to making them successful leaders of tomorrow. He believes, like I think most of us do in this room, that through interactive, personalized learning, we excite the imagination of today's students and thereby get them engaged in learning. I am truly honored that he has agreed to join us today and share his vision for making sure every child, regardless of their background, parents, salary, or zip code, is able to reach their God-given potential. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Rupert Murdoch.
Well, thank you, Jeb, and good morning. I'm glad to see so many people up so early. But I do want to start by thanking my good friends from the Foundation for Excellence in Education. You begin with the conviction that every child can learn. You set high standards, and your good work is bringing us closer to the day we all want, when every schoolhouse door is a gateway to the American dream. I'm speaking today as a businessman. So let me come right to the point. We need to tear down an education system designed for the 19th century and replace it with one suited for the 21st. And we need to approach the education industry the way my friend Steve Jobs approached every industry. Most of you know that Steve introduced the Mac with an ad that has since become a legend. Those of you who were watching the 1984 Super Bowl will remember it. It ran only once. It ran only for 1 minute. It shows a female athlete who's being chased by the police of some totalitarian regime. At the climax, the woman rushes up to a large screen where where Big Brother is giving a speech. Just as he announced, "We shall prevail," she hurls a hammer through the screen. With that, Big Brother's whole world comes crashing down. Arnie Duncan, the Secretary of Education, says we have to stop dumbing down standards and stop lying to our children and their families. And that's putting it lightly. At the top end, our public schools are producing fewer and fewer graduates who have the skills for the world's best jobs. At the bottom end, each year, more than 1 million Americans, that's 7,000 every school day, drop out of high school. This is a human tragedy for these individuals in terms of how it all but guarantees them a life of poverty. And it's a national tragedy for America in terms of the huge social costs this is imposing on our future. And in the middle, too many American children float from grade to grade in schools that never challenge them. These are kids who could soar, but are instead held to the ground because of a mediocre education. We're all here today because we recognize all this is unjust, unsustainable, and un-American. And it's a crime against our children. And it's especially galling because we have the technology to change it. Now the front pages of the New York Times complain that technology's promise has not yet been realized in terms of student performance. My answer to them is this: of course not. Think of it this way. If we attach computers to leeches, medicine wouldn't be any better than it was in the 19th century. When doctors used to bleed patients. But the same goes for education. You don't get change by plugging in computers to schools designed for the industrial age. You get it by developing technology that rewrites the rules of the game by centering learning around the learner. So this morning, I'd like to talk about three broad issues. My first two parts have to do with challenges: the crisis of imagination and the crisis of rising costs. In my last part, I offer the good news. With the common standards and a competitive market, we can deliver a first-class education to any child from any background in any classroom in America. This is not a dream, it's a fact. Let me start with imagination. Earlier, I mentioned Steve Jobs. I came to know Steve over the last 2 years when we worked together to create the first totally digital newspaper, The Daily, which we launched on the iPad earlier this year. Our children are growing up in Steve Jobs' world. They're eager to learn and quick to embrace new technology. Outside the classroom, they take all this for granted in what they read, in how they listen to music, and how they shop. Outside the classroom, they take it for granted that people will compete to meet their individual needs and expectations. The minute they step back into their classrooms, it's a different story. It's like going back in time. In the essentials, most American classrooms haven't changed much since the days of Grover Cleveland. You have a teacher, a piece of chalk, a blackboard, and a room full of kids. If they're lucky, today you might see a whiteboard off to the side or some computers in the library. Ask teachers how that's working out. Ask them about dealing with 30 different kids with different needs and different ways of learning. For kids, I think this top-down, one-size-fits-all approach frustrates the ones who could do more advanced work. And it leaves further and further behind those who need extra help to keep up. Teachers are likewise stunted. Some excel at lecturing. Some are better at giving personal attention. With the right structure, they would work together like a football team. With the present structure, they are all treated like interchangeable cogs. Steve Jobs wouldn't have accepted this, and he didn't. Shortly after he died, the mother of a 3-year-old posted a note on how her iPad had allowed her autistic son, who does not talk, to find his voice. In a similar way, a North Carolina school district had only 26% of its students go on to college until they adopted programs for the Mac. Now, a majority go on to college. The point I'm making isn't about Apple. It's about our complacency and our colossal failure of imagination. The education industry bears a good part of the blame for this sad state of affairs. It continues to sell its tired wares into a falling status quo. It settles for mediocre charter schools, and its answer is simply throwing more money at the problem. I have a different view. I believe we need to take what is wrong so well outside the classroom and use it to shake up the classroom, to make mathematics sticky, to micro-target the 8th grade girls who might want to be physicists, and to personalize reading for each child. Let's put it this way. If you were designing an American classroom to give our children the skills they need for the best jobs of the 21st century, what would it look like? A typical public school or one of Steve Jobs' Apple stores? That leads to the second challenge, the unsustainable cost of doing nothing. On its own, the performance of our public school system is disgraceful. Worse, we're paying more and more for it and getting less and less in return. In April 1983, the Department of Education released a report called A Nation at Risk. And here's how it described the problem back then, and I quote, "If an unfriendly foreign power had attempted to impose on America the mediocre educational performance that exists today, we might well have viewed it as an act of war. As it stands, we have allowed this to happen to ourselves," unquote. In the 3 decades since those words were written, we have doubled our per-pupil spending in real terms, doubled it. But our achievement scores have been flat. It's a whole generation lost and written off. As I speak, 2/3 of our 8th graders are scoring below proficient in maths and reading. The crisis is even more acute for our minority students. Today, the average African American or Latino 9-year-old is 3 grades behind in these subjects. We all know that a child who is not reading at grade level by that age will probably never catch up. Look behind these grim statistics, and you will find the human toll of our complacency. Lost opportunity, crushed dreams, and lives condemned to the margins of American prosperity. That's where technology comes in. The iPod compelled the music industry to accommodate its customers. With the right technology, we can do the same for education. For example, say I was trying to reach a 10-year-old about teach a 10-year-old about Bernoulli's principle. According to this principle, when speed is high, pressure is low. Sounds pretty dry and abstract. But what if I could bring this lesson alive by linking it to the football star Roberto Carlos, by showing students a video clip that illustrates how his famous curved shot is an example of Bernoulli's principle in action. And then suppose I followed up with an engineer from Boeing who explained to these students why this same principle is critical in aviation and introduced an app that could help them master the concept through playing a game. Is there any doubt that most students would learn more about this principle from this kind of lesson than from reading almost any chapter in their textbooks? Couple these demonstrations with assessment tools that provide teachers with instant feedback to demonstrate how well their students had mastered the material. Is there any question that the results would be far superior to what we do now? Wait for the teacher to give a test, grade it, and return it to the student. Better doesn't have to be more expensive either. Just as the latest MacBook Air delivers far more capability at a far lower price to far more people than the Mac computers of the 80s and 90s, education technology is already doing the same. For example, Georgia state legislators now spend $40 million a year on textbooks. They're considering iPads to save money and boost performance. Unlike a textbook, which is outdated the moment it is printed, digital text can be updated. Today, 600 school districts around the country are experimenting with iPads, and we know a lot more when the results are in. Textbooks aren't the only area for savings. Rocket Ship's charter schools in San Jose use a model that combines traditional classroom learning with individualized instruction through online technology called Dreambox Learning. So far, the program has brought higher performance with lower costs, freeing up the school to pay teachers more, hire tutors, and so on. So let's be clear, technology is never going to replace teachers. What technology can do is give teachers closer, more human, and more rewarding interactions with their students. At the same time, Technology can give children lesson plans tailored to their pace and needs. And it can give school districts a way to improve performance in the classroom while saving their taxpayers' money. So we come to my last point. Everything I've spoken about is possible in the here and now. But the investments the private sector needs to make simply will not happen without some agreement about what we expect our students to learn. In the past, I've said that the standards for America's public schools are lower than our standards for American Idol. Since I spoke those words, I've had some backup from the ACT, an independent education organization that handles college testing. Recently, this organization reported that 3/4 of American students who graduate from high school are not ready to do college work. 3/4. And these are the kids who are going to college. This is not the foundation for a 21st century economy. This is not the kind of achievement-oriented system that will give our children the education they need to compete in today's world. In truth, it's the kind of number you would expect from a third world country. Digital gives us the means to transform this dismal status quo and to do it quickly. But we will not get far until we have a clear answer to a basic question. What is the core body of knowledge our children need to know to compete with their peers across the world and maintain our lead as a free nation? I don't pretend to be an expert on academic standards, but as a business leader, I do know something about how common standards unlock investment and unleash innovation. For example, once we established standards for MP3 and Wi-Fi and the internet, innovators had every incentive to invest their brains and capital in building the very best products compatible with that standard. With those standards in place, investors were willing to take bigger risks because there were bigger rewards. These rewards did not stop at America's borders either. All around the world, talented people were working on solving the same problems, and companies tapped into this talent. We are now seeing the same thing happening in education. Over the last few years, leaders and educators in more than 40 states have come together to reach agreement on what their students should know and be able to do in math and English, and by what grades. One reason these state leaders have come together is that they have taken a look around the world. They know that the student in, say, San Francisco is not just competing against his classmate or even the kid from St. Louis. He's competing with his peers in Shanghai, Lima, and Prague. Now, it's true that setting standards will help News Corporation as we try to figure out what programs our schools need. I must note, however, that common standards will give every one of my competitors the exact same advantage. And that's how it should be in a free and competitive market. Let me conclude with a word about where we go from here. The way I see it, this is not a Republican issue or a Democratic issue. It's an achievement issue. I see that everywhere I go in the world. In South Korea, I've seen how a competitive education market turns teachers into national celebrities, with some commanding salaries we reserve for rock stars and football players. In Sweden, I've seen an innovative knowledge school which give kids a knowledge portal that allow them to use their curiosity to take them places they've never been. In China, I meet many students that somehow have a better chance for a decent education than a child growing up in our nation's capital. You can see that same dynamic right here in this room. Joel Klein is a Democrat who served in the Clinton administration and as Chancellor of New York City's public schools. Jeb Bush is the former governor of Florida from a prominent Republican family. Both men are for setting high standards, expanding the choices open to parents, and ensuring greater accountability. During Jeb's time as governor, Florida registered dramatic improvement on the National Achievement Tests, especially among minority students. During Joel's time as chancellor, New York City showed big improvement in both its national test scores and its high school graduation rates. They're here today because they know that whatever their success, we are still far from where we should be. Steve Jobs was like that too. He was a Silicon Valley liberal who believed that monopolies like our public school system do not work, and therefore that parents deserved school vouchers for their children. He was a man who spent his life on technology, yet knew that the teacher was more important than the computer. He once explained our public school system this way. I remember seeing a bumper sticker and the telephone company was all one. I remember seeing a bumper sticker with the Bell logo on it, and it said, "We don't care, we don't have to." And that's what a monopoly is. That's what IBM was in their day. And that's certainly what the public school system is. They don't have to care. Well, we do have to care. In this new century, good is not good enough. Our children are our destiny. We've wasted enough time. At stake now is the defining promise of the American dream, the promise of upward mobility for each new generation. Put simply, we must approach education the way Steve Jobs approached every industry he touched, to be willing to blow up what doesn't work or gets in the way, and to make our bet that if we can engage a child's imagination, there's no limit to what he or she can learn. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. All right?
Well, thank you, Rupert. I thought maybe we'd take a little time and have a brief discussion here and then open it up for questions from the audience. Let me start with what I think is a fundamental question and much on the minds of the people in this room. And that is, given the state of education as you describe it today, so many kids not getting the education they're going to need to compete in the 20th century, America faces a lot of challenges right now. Where would you rank this in terms of the importance of this educational challenge that our country faces?
Oh, I think it's number one. I mean, there's a more urgent problem with the economy and finding jobs for people. But on the other hand, this is, the greatest cost we could possibly be imposing upon ourselves. And we all know the different stories from different cities, but it's not that just kids drop out of high school not being able to read or write and not being able to get decent jobs ever in their lives, but a high proportion of them actually end up in the prison system within 3 or 4 years. And that's another, never mind the financial cost, it's just another terrible tragedy.
You've looked at the media, the entertainment world, been through the changes that have taken place. What would you say are the sort of dramatic things that have happened that are so very different today in those worlds than they were 20 or 30 years ago?
Well, we've had several revolutions, but of course, 20, 30 years ago, but 40, 50 years ago, it was radio. 20, 30 years ago, it was the coming of television. And then now the mass proliferation of television and the choice that people now which is all, I think, wonderful. But now we have the huge problem of digital and digitizing newspapers. Will people be reading basically on computer screens and tablets, or will they still like sort of tactile books and newspapers? I think they're going to change, but I think it's going to take, it'll change over a few years, won't be overnight. But it's a big challenge to the businesses concerned and to everything. And also, I think one of the problems, they talk about newspaper circulations falling, I think, one of the problems is education. Kids, are not learning to read the way they used to. The reading public is going down in number. But even beyond that, you have this sort of very short staccato. People can pick up their smartphones in the morning and get 10 headlines and decide they're not interested in that day's news, or they're just a couple of things. So there's really chaos out there in the world of information. It's coming from every quarter. Everybody's got a blog. Some are good and some are rubbish. And it's asking a lot for everybody to be able to work out what's good and what's bad. I don't want to exaggerate that problem, but there is a degree of chaos in the supply of information. Better having it this way than when it was just monopolized. But we have to pass through this and see it get better.
In your speech in Paris, you said that virtually every other field had gone through a technological revolution, except for education. Why do you think there's so much resistance in education to the kinds of technological transformation we've seen in areas like media or medicine or so forth? Well,
I've been with you and visited School of One in New York and so on, and where there is no resistance. I do think, I've got to be honest about it, it's not the average teacher, but it is the teachers' union, and who have sort of held back any change at all, and any experimentation. But where you see this having been broken, like you did in a couple of schools in New York, many schools, but a couple of schools in New York, is really exciting to watch the children work in a totally different way. We went to one, there was a room with perhaps 100 kids in it, all in little groups of 8 and 10 people, either teaching themselves, reading quietly, or actually on their PCs interactively learning their maths or whatever it was. One kid I talked to was working interactively, and I said, "Where's your teacher?" And he said, "I think he's in Mumbai." And why not? The best teachers in the world should be available to all our kids.
Let's take a few questions from the audience, because we don't have a lot of time left. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
It's all right.
It's not a wise move from me. Let's see if we got some questions over there. Chris, you got a question?
My name is Chris Surf, and I'm Commissioner of Education in New Jersey. So we distribute about $25 billion a year. We have about 2,500 schools. And I can assure you and others that without the partnership with private sector capital, private sector innovation, long-term R&D investment, we are never going to move beyond the state that we're in today. So I'm fascinated by the sort of byplay back and forth about the sort of private sector being a source of a problem as opposed to an inevitable part of the solution. But that leads to my question, which I can direct at either or both of you, and that is, clearly there are impediments to progress that have locked us that have locked in the existing order in a pretty resistant kind of way. To what extent does technology create an opportunity to break through those barriers, and to what extent do those barriers prevent the technological revolution from happening?
Joel, what do you have? You
So
feel?
I think you put your finger exactly on the right issue, Chris. I think there are barriers out there. Some of them, for example, seat time requirements, requiring that you actually have to have some teacher in the classroom right then and there, rather than, for example, the kind of program we saw at the School of One. I think some of the procurement policies, some of the political issues are the barriers. At the same time, you see those barriers beginning to move away now in K-12 education, not just the School of One or a school that we visited in Sweden, but you look here, you've got people from Carpe Diem who are here, and you look at what they're doing at their school in Arizona, and it's become a place where people go to learn. Rupert mentioned during his speech the rocket ship schools not far from here in San Jose, and John Danner and his team, who are not just adopting a model, but constantly changing that model. And I want to give Jeb and the team here at the foundation a lot of credit, because what Jeb and Governor Wise did together in focusing this issue and in evaluating states and their policies is the beginning of a dialogue. But there's no question that this, at least from my perception, in the last 5 to 7 years, the discussion has moved dramatically. And as a result of that, I think in the next several years, we're going to see some remarkable changes in the way we deliver K-12 education. And I don't think anybody doubts the need for significant transformative change. And I think that Clay Christensen, Michael Horn, and their work on disrupting class really presaged the revolution we're going to see. I sure hope so.
I'd just add that, seeing you all here today and knowing all your interest in and what is going on across the country, there are so many things happening. It's really very exciting and encouraging. But, we've got to realize you're only touching probably less than 10% of the kids out there at the moment. But you're doing so much, and as you get success, parents are going to demand that what you're doing spreads, and there will be huge change. But there's going to be fights on the way.
Tony?
Morning. Thank you for being here. And again, to echo what Chris said, thanks for the way you handled, Chris said our friends, I would call them our clowns. I have a question for both of you, because Joe, you've been at the district level as one of the nation's leading reformers, and Mr. Murdoch, you speak eloquently of what we need to do from, a corporate level. From your respective positions, what would each of you say to lawmakers, policymakers, to accelerate the pace that we need to move? Because my concern, both of you, Joe, you just said several years. Our kids don't have several years. So what do we do to accelerate the pace of change and implementing the type of things that need to be implemented for our children?
Well, clearly, we're going to have to go state by state, school district by school district, and win them over. In some cases, it involves probably some pretty ugly political fights. But I don't think there's any question that it's going to work, and that in the end, by meetings like this and talking more about it, the parents of children in America are going to really demand this. And so it'll become a political issue, but I think we'll be on the right side of it.
So I'd say two things, Tony. One, I do think parents have got to get engaged and understand that their kids' future depends on getting educated to a level that they didn't necessarily have to get educated to. I always say, those of you heard me say yesterday, the thing that bothers me most is every major school district I've ever been to, I've never seen anyone say they would allow their child to be randomly assigned to a school in that school district. Not a person in this room would allow your child to be randomly assigned to a school in San Francisco, Chicago, LA, or New York. So we have these schools that I call OPC, other people's children, that it's good enough for them, but not good enough for ours. We have got to create a demand by parents that says, if it's not good enough for my kid, it's not good enough for any kid. The second issue, Tony, and you and so many other people in this room are doing it, we need leadership, bold leadership. People who get elected to office, your first responsibility is to your community, to your city, to your state, and to your children. It's not to your re-election. And as soon as we start to realize that what leadership is to change the facts on the ground, and when people see that, re-election follows leadership. Leadership doesn't follow re-election. And when I see what you... Oh, look at, think about this. I remember when, first time I went to Florida, was because I heard, and again, Rupert said, I worked in the Clinton administration, so for a guy like me to travel all the way to Florida, Tallahassee, you can't get there from here, to travel there to meet with a guy named Bush was a weird experience. And Phil Handy's here, who set that trip up, and Kathleen Shanahan. But I went down there for one reason. I had heard about what Florida was doing with their accountability system. And I had heard that this governor laid a letter grade on every single school. Wasn't like No Child Left Behind. They have a thing called CINI. My parents used to say, what's a CINI? I had no clue. You know, it was like they purposely put an acronym that nobody would know what it means. Everybody knew what an A school was. Everybody knew what an F school was. And that was bold leadership. And if you have any doubts about whether that works, I'll give you two clues. Look at 2003 to 2009 on the national scores, and you see what they did in 4 tests. They went up at an unprecedented level. Overall, for their lowest income kids, they went up over 40 points. 10 points per test is 1 grade in learning. That's a massive change. Look at Hispanic children or black children in Florida. They're outperforming states. Those kids are outperforming the state of California that are here now. Why did that happen? Because Jeb Bush didn't hold his finger to the air to figure out which way the wind is blowing. He decided which way the wind was blowing. No, but look, I'm not blowing smoke at you. Leadership, what'd you say? You know I'm not blowing smoke at you? No, leadership is the thing. And when I see the Chiefs for Change and I see Paul Pastorak, people are going to understand what happened in a recovery district in Louisiana didn't happen randomly. When you see the results they're getting now, that happened because Paul Pastorak wasn't afraid to lead. Tony Bennett in Indiana isn't afraid to lead. And so when people say, you know, the worst thing in the world is not to challenge orthodoxy, is not to take on the tough fights. Right. The worst thing in the world is to watch our kids slowly, steadily, and surely go downhill because we weren't brave enough to do things that people said you can't get done. And now other states are putting A to F grades on their schools, and other states are imposing accountability and choice. And if we get that leadership, and there's so many people in this room, legislators and others, who can do that, we can change the world for our children. And if we don't, shame on all of us.
Great.
So what can I possibly say after this morning? Those closing words, shame on all of us if we don't stand up and do something for our kids. If we could all just give another round of applause to Mr. Murdoch.
Great.